This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on Wildlife Protection Amendment Bill 2022. The participants are Mukul Sandwal, environmentalist, and Chetan Chauhan, journalist.
The Parliament yesterday passed the Wildlife Amendment Bill, which is bringing sea changes in the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which was one of the first laws in the country to provide protection to wildlife in the country after the Stockholm Conference of the head of the states, in which former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi participated. Dr. Mukul, can you brief us more about the amendments which have been passed by the Parliament?
You have made a very important point that the motivation for the Wildlife Bill was the Stockholm Conference of 1972. So we implemented those ideas that conservation is important. We need protection of wildlife because they are an essential part of the ecosystem, which is an essential part of life itself. And therefore, we need to protect the areas to multiply their numbers and so that their habitat expands and we continue to benefit from their biodiversity. That was the philosophy at 1972. But the local conditions of India have always been different because unlike in other parts of the world, in the Western world particularly, there are people living in these forests. They are not wastelands or wilderness in the Western sense. There are people living in these forests who are dependent on these forests for firewood, for grazing, for water, for passage for their animals. Just as elephants migrate, local villagers also shift their cattle from grazing from one patch to another so that the previous patch can regenerate itself. They have learned these management methods over generations and they have been successful. There is a view that the change that took place was, yes, part of population expansion, but also because of exploitation of these forests for commercial use. And that was excluded because vast areas were declared essential. And that result is apparent to us. The number of elephants, the tigers, the other animals have increased hugely. Now, as the animals expand, they travel out. Elephants migrate from one part to another because they consume a lot of green matter. Elephant corridors have been created. Now, what this Wildlife Act has done is that it has added to protection the words conservation and management. So it is just not focused on the wild animals to protect them and expand their number and expand their survival for benefit of future generations of human beings, basically, but for conservation and management of the area. Now, when you shift your focus from the species or the animals to the area, you have a very different approach to protection of the animal. It is just not protection of the animal itself, but there is more to it. And that more, I think, has been introduced in this act. The Prime Minister has very wisely, with a great vision, focused on the tribal areas who traditionally had control over their forests in the sense that the administration or the governance system had not penetrated into these forests. There was no need, there was no accessibility. Commercial exploitation meant first construction of roads in the Himalayan tract. The big exploitation of timber took place when it was realized that you could float the logs down a river. All that was not possible here. So they have remained pristine areas. They have remained poor areas because there was no electricity, no communication, modern government facilities, services had not penetrated. Now all that is changing gradually. Now, along with that has come the realization that we need to balance the interests of the people living in the forest. And the question then comes how to balance it. Now, that beginning has been made here. The right of grazing, the right of transit of the cattle, the right for access to water sources has been provided. It is only the beginning. A management plan is bound to emerge, should emerge. Because just as you have Gram Sabhas and municipal wards outside the sanctuary, you need to have some village communities, village panchayats kind of structure for the people to manage their local use. Commercial exploitation or anything sent outside the forest area would still need to be regulated. And this exists in Uttarakhand. The forest panchayats manage the internal arrangement of how much grazing, where to graze, access to water, firewood. But they cannot exploit the forest in the sense commercial exploitation still means that you need a permit from the forest department who check the flow or the transport of these items. So that I think is a very big change, shift in the objective and manner of implementation of this is I think revolutionary in a sense. Because as I said, this situation doesn't exist in the Western world from where these ideas came. The second issue comes that the elephant in India is used and in Southeast Asia, which is basically Indian influence, in religious and other ceremonies as part of our cultural life or as part of our economic life. Now, this recognition has also come that since they are part of our culture in a sense, how do we balance the need for their protection, the need to check over-exploitation, the ivory trade, and their use as part of our cultural life? So this balance is also being struck. It is only an indicator. We need to see what rules will emerge and how they will be implemented. But the opening has been made. The recognition is there that it, along with the protection of the animal, we need to see their part they played to traditional culture, civilization, and the economy. The third big change I think that has come about is that there is a recognition that the wild animals can also cause crop damage. And this is not a feature abroad, because in the Western world, the problem is from the bears or from the mountain cats. The Africa has a large number of elephants, but there are no villages near those vast tracts. Those vast tracts of land are uninhabited. They are only inhabited by graziers. The Maasai, for example, in Kenya, who take their cattle there. But the area, the population is small. The wildlife sanctuary area, or the wild areas, if I may call it, are huge. The number of wild animals is also more. But that balance can be maintained better there than here, because of our population, because of the size, and because of the permanent villages inside the forest. So that balance is also being struck, that if these animals come out and destroy crops, something must be done at the local level. It cannot be that you define a vermin, as this has been called in the Act, or someone that needs to be exterminated, will only be rats. Rats was the problem in the developed world. That is not such a problem in our country. So the provision has been made that nilgais, for example, can be exterminated or their numbers reduced. The herds of nilgai, if they cross a field or cross an agriculture area, destroy all the crops. The entire crop can get destroyed. Some balance is needed there. So again, the opening has been made that at the local level, you can declare these animals. Vermin mean that they can be culled, they can be shot. But the area where this can happen, the period when this will happen, and the numbers that it will be happening are all to be regulated. But I think the important point is that an opening has been made to recognize the particular conditions of our country and not just ideas imported from abroad. And that, I think, is the most revolutionary step. Following Prime Minister's notion of Atmanirbhar Bharat, in a sense, this is Atmanirbharta, meaning that we need to have established management and conservation plans in light with our condition, keeping in mind the ecological limit. And for that, scientific committee has been approved because that is a science-based issue. So up to now, it was only enforcement of a law, administrative functionaries, governance. Now, it is not only the people, the culture, the economic system, but also science has been brought into it as an essential element.
But Mukulji, a lot of questions have also been raised by people who are working in the field of environment, wildlife, and forest about some possible drawbacks of the bill. One is that it can lead to an increase in human-animal conflict, especially in the areas in and around wildlife sanctuaries, which is a good population of wild animals. Because in the recent past, we have seen because of the population increase in congestion in the wildlife, the animals are coming out and attacking the domestic cattle, leading to a conflict in which the animals have been killed by villagers also. And these animals are allowed inside the forest. Then the possibility of such conflict between the domestic animals and the wild animals may increase and can lead to further confrontation. We have seen in many states from Uttarakhand to Bihar to Rajasthan also that it had become a political issue, even in Maharashtra, that the demand to declare the animal a man-eater has risen politically. Second issue which has also been raised is about elephant, whether the relaxation given on elephant management, on use of elephants not commercially but in other traditional work can lead to increase in poaching in lieu of the use of animals for some other purpose. It can also lead to a removal of wild elephants which are not very healthy to outside the forest and for some sort of a commercial use, maybe for private zoos. So these concerns are there. So what do you say about these concerns being raised?
The man-animal conflict is traditional. But if you really analyze the conflicts, they were at the border of the sanctuary and the villages across the border of the sanctuary. The animals straying out of the sanctuary into the village fields, elephants moving into the sugarcane fields, or a wounded tiger or leopard finding easy prey in domestic animals in the villages on the border of the sanctuary was a key issue. There have been very few cases of man-animal conflict inside the sanctuary because they are in balance. The way they interact, the local villagers know from history, from their tradition, because they keep going there. They have an understanding. And it is only a wounded or a ill wild animal that will attack human beings or even cattle if there is enough prey, natural habitat. And that has been provided. So since there is adequate alternatives for these wild animals for their food and sustenance, that I think will not be such a big issue. But the most important point here is that the number of cattle the tribal people, for example, take, or the shepherds that take into the Himalayan areas for grazing, have reduced because people have moved out of these remote areas into the mainstream economic activity. And since the normal policy of the state is to educate people, when they are educated, they are not going into the graze cattle, they are not going into living in the mountain pastures with their sheep. So they will move into the cities, they will move into regular employment. So the number is likely to come down. I think an opening has been made, the rules will be framed, implementation will be done, and the fact that there will be some involvement of scientific experts, local people with the bureaucracy, I think a new balance will come up and this will take care of it. As far as the elephant issue is concerned, yes, you are right. The elephant is an expensive animal to keep. And as inflation and costs are going up, they need a huge amount of green fodder, sugar cane. I mean, as a treat, but they need a huge amount of green fodder every day. They need to be looked after. Now, it is easy to look after horses, you breed them, or cattle. But elephant is a big animal. The expenditure is proportionate to that. But then the question is that this bill, it is the implementation and the rule, they should provide for the management of this animal outside the sanctuary area. So, gradually a new balance again, as I said, will emerge, where these animals kept for religious purposes or otherwise, outside the sanctuary or outside the forest areas, will also be regulated. Now, traditionally there were people going around with bears and monkeys. That has stopped. But this keeping elephants outside is not in the same category. Those were poor people taking monkeys and bears to eke a living. Here these elephants are kept by the richer folk and they may be neglected. They may want to save expenditure on their upkeep. But that is easier to regulate than regulate a very poor man going from place to place, making a little bit of money with monkeys and bears dancing. So, the essence of the issue, I think, is that a door has been opened to look at this issue, not just in terms of protection of an animal, endangered animal,